A child opens their eyes somewhere in ancient Europe, and for a moment the world looks back at something it has almost never seen before. Around that child are people whose eyes are dark with pigment brown and black like wet earth, like charred wood, like the deep pupils of animals watching from a forest edge. Their faces belong to a hard landscape of cold mornings, smoky shelters, rivers swollen with meltwater, and skies that can turn from silver to iron in a single afternoon. Nothing about this place seems designed for delicacy. The ground remembers ice, the air carries hunger. Families move carefully through a world where a broken bone, a failed hunt, or one bad winter can decide who remains in the story and who disappears from it. And yet inside this ordinary human body behind a newborn face, no different in its need for warmth and milk and sleep, a small genetic accident has opened a strange window. The eyes are not truly blue in the way a berry is blue or the way pigment stains a shell or a stone. There is no blue dye hidden in the iris, no secret pool of colour. What appears blue is in a sense a beautiful absence. It is what happens when the front layers of the iris contain very little melanin and light enters, scatters, and returns to the observer in shorter wavelengths. The colour is created by structure, not paint. It is a trick of biology and light, a quiet optical illusion carried in living tissue. That is already strange enough. But the deeper mystery is not simply how blue eyes look blue. The deeper mystery is why they exist at all. For most of human history, they should have been unlikely. Dark eyes are ancient, practical, and dominant across the species. They protect against bright sunlight more effectively. They arise from higher melanin in the iris, and they belong to the inheritance of people who evolved under strong equatorial light long before any human community reached the far northern latitudes where blue eyes would become common. In that older world, the human face was not pale-eyed. It was marked by pigment shaped by sun, and adapted to landscapes where glare and ultraviolet radiation were not abstract forces but daily realities. Blue eyes, by contrast, are latecomers. They are a small deviation in the machinery of inheritance, a change that does not build a new organ or grant an obvious survival advantage. They do not make a hunter faster. They do not make a child stronger. They do not stop winter from entering the bones. And still they spread. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of blue eyes is not really a story about beauty, though beauty will eventually enter it. It is not simply a story about Europeans, though Europe becomes one of its great stages. It is not even only a story about eyes. It is a story about how tiny changes survive in small human groups, how chance can masquerade as destiny, how migration carries accidents across continents, and how the bodies of a living people preserve clues from vanished worlds. The first unsettling thing is that blue eyes are both familiar and improbable. In many modern societies they are so visible in film advertising, portraiture, and popular imagination that they can feel almost ordinary. Yet globally they remain a minority trait. Their strongest concentrations sit in northern and eastern Europe, and in populations descended from those regions, but even there their distribution is uneven, layered and historically complicated. They are not a simple marker of one ancient tribe, one lost race, or one clean origin story. Human ancestry almost never works that way. What survives in the record suggests a far messier process, one made of repeated movement mixing isolation and accident. The evidence remains incomplete, but genetic research points toward a crucial change near the OCA2 gene involving a regulatory region often associated with HERC2. Put simply, the mutation does not destroy the body's ability to make pigment everywhere. It reduces the expression of pigment in the iris. That distinction matters. A person with blue eyes is not lacking melanin throughout the body in the way seen in albinism. Instead, a very specific switch seems to be turned down in a very specific place. The result is subtle, survivable, and visible enough that other humans would have noticed it immediately. Imagine that first appearance not as a thunderclap, not as a miracle, but as a quiet irregularity in a small band of people. Perhaps no one understands it as inheritance. Perhaps it is simply a strange child, a pale gaze, a face that catches attention around the fire. In a world without written records, without mirrors of glass, without words for genes or mutations, the trait has no scientific explanation. It is just there. If the child survives, grows, finds a mate, has children, the trait has a chance to continue. If the child dies young, it may vanish as if it never happened. Human history is full of such almost events, biological possibilities, that flicker once and are swallowed by time. That is why blue eyes are such a useful mystery. They force us to look at evolution without the comforting idea that every surviving trait must have a grand purpose. Some traits spread because they help, some disappear because they harm, but many move through populations because of chance, because of who happens to survive a famine, who crosses a river, who joins another group, who has more children, who is remembered by the body rather than by name. Scholars still debate how much natural selection, sexual selection, and random genetic drift each contributed to the rise of blue eyes. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. The trait sits at the crossroads of biology and history, and that makes it more interesting than any simple answer. The landscape around this mystery is enormous. It reaches back into Africa, where early humans lived under powerful sunlight. It passes through the long migrations out of Africa across Western Asia, into Europe, and into lands repeatedly transformed by ice ages. It moves through hunter-gatherer camps, early farming villages, steppe migrations, burial grounds, ancient DNA laboratories, and modern faces on city streets. Along the way, it overturns some easy assumptions. Ancient Europeans did not all look like modern Europeans. Some early hunter-gatherers in Europe may have had dark skin and blue eyes, a combination that surprises many people because modern categories have trained the eye badly. Later farmers arrived with different ancestry. Steppe herders brought still more. The Europe that eventually became strongly associated with light eyes was not born whole. It was assembled, and at the centre of that assembly is a tiny alteration, not a kingdom, not a battle, not a monument of stone, but a molecular change hidden in the dark interior of reproduction. It passes from parent to child silently. It waits behind brown-eyed generations. It appears, disappears, resurfaces. It is shaped by marriages no one recorded, by migrations, no one mapped, by children whose names are lost forever. The blue eye is therefore not just a colour. It is a surviving trace of deep time, a fragile signal from people who left no writing, no portraits, and often no graves that anyone has found. So the question is not merely why blue eyes exist. The better question is how something so unlikely managed to remain visible in the human story. To follow that thread, we have to begin before blue entered the world, in a time when the human gaze was almost certainly darker, older, and better suited to the bright ancestral landscapes where our species first learned to endure, long before any human child is born with eyes that seem to hold the colour of a northern sky. The story begins under a stronger sun. It begins in Africa, in landscapes where light does not merely illuminate the world but presses upon it. The sunlight is direct, white and fierce. It strikes open grassland, dry riverbeds, forest edges, stone water, skin and eyes, with a force that shapes life over thousands upon thousands of generations. In such a world, pigment is not decoration. It is protection. It is part of the body's quiet negotiation with the environment, a chemical answer to the problem of radiation glare and survival beneath a sky that gives life and threatens it at the same time. The ancestral human eye is almost certainly dark. Not because early humans made a choice, not because one colour was somehow more natural in a romantic sense, but because dark irises are rich in melanin, and melanin has work to do. In the iris, pigment absorbs stray light, reduces scattering inside the eye, and helps manage the intensity of brightness entering through the pupil. In the skin, melanin helps protect folate and living cells from ultraviolet radiation. In hair, it contributes to shielding and heat response. The exact evolutionary pressures are complex, and scholars still debate the details of how skin pigmentation shifted across different environments. But the broad pattern is clear enough: in high ultraviolet regions, more pigment offers real advantages. Eyes are not skin, but they belong to the same long conversation between body and sunlight. A dark iris does not make a person immune to eye disease, and a light iris does not doom anyone to weakness, but darker pigmentation can provide a more protective filter against intense light. For early humans living close to the equator, this matters. Bright glare bouncing from water, pale soil and open land is not a minor inconvenience. It affects hunting-gathering movement, and the simple ability to see clearly when seeing clearly can mean food danger or direction. In this older world, dark eyes are not mysterious. They are expected. That expectation matters because it shows how strange blue eyes are by comparison. They're not the starting point. They're not a hidden default waiting to emerge everywhere. They are a later variation appearing within a species already deeply marked by melanin. To understand why this is important, imagine human ancestry not as a neat ladder, but as a branching river. For most of its course, that river runs dark-eyed. Populations separate, meet, adapt, and move, but the basic pigmentation of the iris remains heavily weighted toward brown. Even today, brown eyes remain the most common human eye color across the planet. They are not rare, exotic, or secondary. They are the ancient majority. The early migrations of Homo sapiens carry that ancient majority outward. Groups leave Africa in waves, moving through the Levant across parts of Arabia, into Western and Southern Asia, and eventually toward Europe, Sahel, and the far edges of Eurasia. These movements are not single heroic marches. They are slow, broken, repeated expansions, retreats, and local settlements unfolding over immense time. People follow coastlines, rivers, animals, seasons, and opportunities. Some groups vanish, others merge with neighboring populations. Some leave descendants in living people, while others become genetic whispers inside the wider human story. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for the earliest periods, but what survives suggests a world of constant motion rather than one dramatic departure. In these migrations, eye color is only one tiny part of the larger biological inheritance. The people moving through these regions carry dark eyes, varied skin tones shaped by ancestry and environment, and bodies adapted not to a single destiny, but to survival in changing conditions. As they enter higher latitudes, sunlight becomes less intense, especially in winter. Days shorten. The angle of the sun drops. Ultraviolet radiation weakens. Over many generations, this changing light environment will matter deeply for skin pigmentation because the body needs ultraviolet light to help produce vitamin D. But eye color does not follow the same simple map. This is where the story becomes more difficult and more interesting. Light skin in northern environments can have adaptive explanations tied to vitamin D. Blue eyes are harder to explain that way. For a long time, people tried to read physical traits as if they were clean labels of ancestry. Light skin, light hair, and light eyes were imagined as a package, as though they must have appeared together in one ancient population and spread outward unchanged. Ancient DNA has made that picture collapse. The past is stranger. Some Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in parts of Europe appear to have carried genetic variants associated with blue eyes, while also carrying variants associated with darker skin than many later Europeans. Early farmers moving into Europe from Anatolia often brought lighter skin-associated variants, but may not have had blue eyes at high frequencies. Later steppe-related migrations added still more complexity. These discoveries do not produce a simple portrait, they produce a mosaic. That mosaic tells us that blue eyes did not arrive as part of a complete modern European appearance. They emerged and spread within populations whose overall look may surprise modern observers. This is one of the lesser-known details that changes the emotional texture of the story. The first blue-eyed people may not have looked like the familiar pale northern stereotype. A person could have had dark hair, dark skin by later European standards, and eyes that appeared grey-blue in certain light. The combination feels unexpected only because modern imagination has flattened the past. The ancient world did not arrange itself according to modern categories. It was full of human variation that no longer fits neatly into the boxes later societies built. The biological basis for darker eyes is also more robust than many realize. Eye color is not controlled by a single simple gene in the old classroom sense, even though blue eyes are often taught as a recessive trait. Multiple genes influence pigmentation, and the interaction between them can produce shades from nearly black to amber, hazel green-grey and blue. Still, one region near OCA2 and HERC2 plays a major role in the classic blue eye pattern found in many Europeans. That means the trait is not a random sprinkling of blue pigment, it is a regulatory change in how much melanin the iris receives. The machinery for pigment remains, the switch is altered. Before that switch becomes important, however, the human story is overwhelmingly a story of dark gazes meeting bright worlds. Dark-eyed mothers carry infants across dry landscapes. Dark-eyed hunters watch the movement of antelope. Dark-eyed children learn which plants can feed and which can kill. Dark-eyed elders remember water sources, seasons, and paths through danger. None of these people know they're living before a mutation that future societies will turn into poetry status, suspicion, beauty myth, and pseudoscience. They are simply alive and their eyes are suited to the light around them. This is why the phrase blue eyes shouldn't exist has power even if it must be understood carefully. Of course they can exist because mutations happen constantly, and most are neither dramatic nor impossible. But from the perspective of ancient human adaptation, blue eyes are not the obvious outcome. They are not the expected form of the human iris. They are a later survival of reduced pigment in a species that began under brighter skies. To find how that reduced pigment escaped disappearance, the story must move northward into smaller populations, colder climates, and a continent still recovering from ice. Somewhere there in the broken aftermath of the Ice Age, a tiny change in inheritance finds room to breathe. Somewhere in the long northern passage of human inheritance, a mutation begins to matter. It does not arrive with ceremony. It does not reshape a skull, lengthen a limb, sharpen a tooth, or create a new survival tool that anyone can hold in the hand. It is small, almost invisible except for the way it changes the face. Deep inside the genome near a gene involved in pigment production, a regulatory switch behaves differently. The body still knows how to make melanin. The skin and hair still follow their own complex patterns, but in the iris the signal changes. Less pigment settles into the front layers of the eye, and when light moves through that altered tissue, the gaze begins to take on a pale, cool color that was once exceedingly rare. The major gene often discussed in this story is OCA2, which helps influence the production and distribution of melanin. Yet the most famous blue eye-associated change is not simply inside OCA2 itself. It lies in a neighbouring region, often linked to HERC2, where a regulatory element affects how strongly OCA2 is expressed in the iris. This is an important detail because it keeps the story from becoming too crude. Blue eyes are not the result of a broken human being or a complete loss of pigment. They are not a form of albinism. They are not a sweeping shutdown of colour across the body. They are more like a dimmer switch turned down in one particular place. The evidence remains incomplete in its oldest timelines, but the genetic pattern suggests that many blue-eyed people today share ancestry from a common ancient variant. That idea has led to one of the most striking claims in modern popular genetics, that many blue-eyed people may trace this trait back to a relatively small number of ancestors, perhaps even one original mutation event. The phrase is tempting, almost mythic, as though every blue-eyed person on Earth belongs to a single hidden family. Reality is more cautious. Genetic inheritance is tangled recombination breaks and reshuffles, ancestral segments and populations mix again and again. Still, the shared regulatory change does suggest that the classic European blue eye pattern likely spread from a limited origin, rather than appearing independently in every blue-eyed lineage. No single explanation fully accounts for every shade or every population, but the broad signal is difficult to ignore. The location of that origin is harder to pin down. Researchers have often connected the spread of blue eyes to ancient populations in or near Europe, perhaps somewhere around the Black Sea region or Western Eurasia, but the exact place remains debated. The mutation may have existed before it became common. That distinction matters. A trait can be born in one period and only rise in frequency much later when population circumstances change. For generations it might remain hidden or rare, carried quietly by people who mostly have brown eyes. Then a small group breaks away, survives a bottleneck or expands into new territory, and the rare trait suddenly becomes more visible. Human history is filled with such delayed consequences. To imagine the early life of this mutation, it helps to remove all modern assumptions from the scene. There are no nations, no ethnic labels, no maps with clean borders. There are river valleys, forest edges, caves, open plains, glacial margins, and coastlines that no longer exist in the same form. Groups are small. Kinship matters because survival depends on it. People know one another's scar skills, tempers, and strengths. They do not think of themselves as carriers of alleles. They notice faces. They notice unusual children. They notice anything different because in small communities difference is visible. A blue-eyed child born into such a group would not necessarily be treated as special in any predictable way. Perhaps the trait is admired. Perhaps it is ignored. Perhaps it is unsettling. The record is silent. We cannot hear the first reactions. What survives in the record suggests only the biological outcome the trait did not vanish. At least some people who carried it survived long enough to have descendants, and those descendants moved through enough generations for the mutation to become a recognizable thread in later populations. That alone is remarkable because most mutations do not become famous. They appear drift and disappear into the genetic noise of time. The northern setting may have helped not because blue eyes clearly protected people from darkness or cold, but because small populations can magnify chance. In a large population, a rare trait is like a single pale stone thrown into a wide river. It disappears among countless others. In a small population, that same stone can be noticed again and again. If several carriers belong to a surviving group, if they intermarry within that group, if their descendants happen to flourish, the frequency can rise without the trait needing to provide a dramatic advantage. This is genetic drift, and it is one of the quiet forces behind human diversity. It has no intention. It does not reward beauty or usefulness. It simply reflects the mathematics of inheritance when populations are small and history is uneven. This is where the phrase "the mutation in the north" becomes both useful and dangerous. Useful because blue eyes become strongly associated with northern and eastern Europe regions, where ancient population structure, low winter sunlight, and post-Ice Age recolonization created unusual genetic patterns. Dangerous because it can make the trait seem like a neat adaptation to cold northern skies. The evidence does not support so simple a story. Blue eyes do not produce vitamin D, they do not keep a body warm, they do not provide an obvious survival advantage in snow forest or tundra. If anything, lighter eyes can be more sensitive to glare. So their rise must be understood through a combination of drift founder effects, mate choice, and population history rather than one clean environmental purpose. There is a lesser-known irony here. Some of the earliest known individuals with genetic markers associated with blue eyes do not fit the later image of pale northern farmers or blonde seafarers. Ancient DNA from Western European hunter-gatherers has revealed people who may have carried blue-eye variants while retaining darker pigmentation in skin and hair than many modern Europeans. One famous Mesolithic individual from Iberia, often discussed in this context, carried variants linked to blue eyes, while also showing ancestry and pigmentation markers that complicate older assumptions. These findings do not mean every early hunter-gatherer looked the same. They mean the old package of light skin, light hair, light eyes was not always packaged at all. That matters because the mutation story is not only about colour, but about the collapse of simplistic thinking. Blue eyes are not a badge from a single ancient people. They are not proof of purity, superiority, or any of the fantasies later ideologies tried to attach to physical traits. They are a biological accident that moved through populations as those populations moved through landscapes. The people who carried the mutation hunted, gathered, buried their dead, crossed rivers, endured hunger, and met strangers. Some of those strangers became enemies, some became kin, and some became ancestors. By the time the Ice Age loosens its grip and Europe begins to change again, the blue-eye variant has entered a continent of shifting possibilities. Forests creep into old tundra, animals move, coastlines drown, human groups follow resources into newly opened land. In that unsettled world, a small genetic switch has more chances to travel, hide, reappear, and spread. The mutation has been born or at least preserved, but a mutation alone is not enough. For blue eyes to become more than a rare accident, the world around their carriers must contract, fracture, and open again. It must become a landscape where chance can do the work of destiny. The world that receives the blue-eye mutation is not stable. It is a continent still learning how to live after ice. For tens of thousands of years, Europe has been shaped by cold on a scale difficult to imagine from the softness of the present. Ice sheets sit over the north like a second geology, grinding rock, swallowing valleys, locking water away from the oceans and turning familiar maps into something alien. Sea levels fall, coastlines stretch outward, plains appear where there is now sea. Winds move dust across open steppe. Forests retreat into refuges, surviving in warmer pockets, while vast regions become tundra grassland and frozen emptiness. Human beings live along the margins of this world not as masters of it, but as persistent animals with fire memory tools and one another. In such a landscape, survival is narrow. A group may follow reindeer herds across open country, return to seasonal shelters, gather roots and berries when the season allows fish in rivers when the ice breaks, and repair clothing with the care of people who understand that warmth is not comfort but life. There are no cities, no fields, no granaries waiting behind walls. Food is a moving target. Knowledge is carried in bodies and stories rather than written marks. A child learns landscapes the way modern people learn language, by repetition, attention, and correction. Where water lies under snow, which valley catches wind, which stone can be worked into a blade, which animal tracks are fresh, which silence means weather is changing. These small groups are the stage on which genetic chance becomes powerful. When populations are scattered and thin inheritance behaves differently than it does in large, dense societies. A rare trait can disappear in one family line and rise in another, for reasons that have little to do with usefulness. A winter kills one camp but spares another. A river crossing fails. A disease passes through a cluster of shelters. A few families move east instead of west. A woman with a rare variant has several surviving children, while another line leaves none. Over thousands of years, such details become population history. The evidence remains incomplete because most lives leave no trace at all, but the mathematics is clear enough. Small populations amplify accident. The end of the last glacial maximum does not bring instant relief. It brings instability. Warming comes in pulses. Cold returns. Ice retreats, pauses, advances, and retreats again. Meltwater changes rivers. Vegetation shifts. Animals follow the plant world, and humans follow the animals. Around the edges of the continent, people move into lands newly available for settlement, while others remain in long-inhabited refuges. Iberia, Italy, the Balkans, the Pontic-Caspian region, and other warmer or more habitable zones become reservoirs of life during colder phases. From such places, human groups later expand into emptying or newly green landscapes. This recolonization is not one simple wave. It is a braided movement, layered and uneven, full of groups that meet, merge, and sometimes replace one another. If a blue-eye-associated variant is present in one of these groups, even at low frequency, the conditions are perfect for strange outcomes. Not guaranteed outcomes, but possible ones. The trait may have no great survival value. It may not help a hunter see through snow. It may not protect a gatherer from famine. Yet if the people carrying it are among those who survive and expand, their descendants can carry it into wider territory. This is the quiet force of founder effects. A small founding population does not carry all the variation of the larger population from which it came. It carries a sample. If that sample happens to include a rare trait, the new population may show that trait at a higher frequency than expected. Over time, the accident can begin to look like destiny. Post-Ice Age Europe is full of such sampling. Communities are not evenly mixed across the land. Rivers, mountains, glaciers, forests, and coastlines shape movement. So do custom, kinship, and conflict, though these are harder to see archaeologically. People may choose mates, mostly within nearby groups. They may exchange partners with allied bands. They may avoid strangers or absorb them after crisis. Each pattern affects genes. Each pattern leaves faint signatures in ancient DNA. Those scholars still debate how confidently those signatures can be tied to language, culture, or identity. Stone tools can resemble one another without proving that the same people made them. Burial practices can spread through imitation as well as migration. Genes help, but even genes do not speak in complete sentences. The harshness of this world also reminds us why the survival of a visible trait is never only about the trait itself. A blue-eyed person in a small Ice Age or post-Ice Age community survives because the community survives. Their children live because food is found, because fires are kept, because mothers are supported, because hunters return, because elders remember where to go when the usual place fails. The eye colour is carried on the back of all this ordinary endurance. It is not the hero of the story. It is a passenger inside the larger human struggle. One surprising detail is that much of the land where people may have lived and moved after the Ice Age is now underwater. Lower sea levels once exposed huge coastal plains, including the famous drowned landscapes of the North Sea basin, often called Doggerland. For generations, families could have walked where fish now swim hunted animals across open grasslands and moved between what is now Britain and continental Europe without crossing the modern sea. As the climate warmed and ice melted, water rose. Rivers changed course, marshes spread, coastlines retreated. Human roots vanished beneath waves, taking campsites, graves, and evidence with them. What survives in the record is therefore biased toward places that happen to remain above water or be preserved by luck. The missing landscapes may have held countless clues to how traits, technologies, and people moved. This matters for blue eyes because distribution maps can tempt us into false certainty. We look at modern frequencies and imagine clear pathways backward, but ancient Europe was not shaped like modern Europe. Some of its corridors are drowned. Some of its population centres are invisible. Some groups that mattered genetically may have left little archaeological trace, while others that left beautiful tools or burials may have contributed less to later ancestry than expected. The story of a mutation spreading through this world must therefore be told with humility. It is not a clean arrow on a map. It is more like smoke moving through broken country, sometimes visible, sometimes lost, sometimes gathered again by wind. As forests return after the ice, the human world changes again. The great open steppe gives way in many regions to woodland. Reindeer and mammoth landscapes fade, while deer boar, fish, nuts, and forest resources become increasingly important. People adapt their tools and movements. In some places they become more settled seasonally. In others they continue to range widely. These Mesolithic communities are not primitive leftovers waiting for farmers to arrive. They are skilled inhabitants of changing ecosystems with their own technologies, rituals, and social worlds. Some of them carry genetic lineages that will become part of the later European mosaic. Some may carry the blue-eye variant at meaningful frequencies. Again, the evidence remains incomplete, but ancient DNA has made one thing clear: the Europe of these hunter-gatherers is not a blank page. It is a continent of survivors, and survivors are not always the ones a simple adaptation story would predict. Sometimes they are the ones in the right refuge, sometimes the ones near the right river, sometimes the ones whose children happen to live through a century when others do not. The blue-eye mutation, if it is present among them, benefits from their persistence. It moves where they move. It hides when they are few. It grows when they grow. It becomes woven into the ancestry of people who have no idea that their descendants will one day treat eye colour as a clue to origins, beauty, identity, and myth. The ice withdraws, but it does not leave an empty piece behind. It leaves opportunity and rupture. It leaves land to cross forests, to learn coasts to lose, and small communities whose genetic accidents can become future signatures. In that world of hunger and recovery, blue eyes do not need to be powerful to survive. They only need carriers who endure. And endurance in prehistory is often the strangest force of all. When people imagine evolution, they often imagine a grand test. A trait appears, the world examines it, and if it is useful, it survives. If it is useless, it disappears. This is a clean story, easy to remember, and often wrong in the details that matter most. Nature is not a judge sitting above every generation with a perfect scale. It is weather, hunger, birth, death, distance, disease, accident, and time. A trait may survive because it helps, but it may also survive because it rides along inside a family that happens to endure. It may spread because the people carrying it move into empty land. It may become common because a community begins from only a few founders, and those founders carry a version of inheritance that would have remained rare in a larger population. In small human groups, chance has room to become history. This is the strange power of bottlenecks. A bottleneck happens when a population is sharply reduced, or when a new population is formed from a small sample of a larger one. The image is simple. A wide flow narrows, and only some of what once existed passes through. Genes behave in the same way. A large population may contain many variants, most of them rare. But if only a few families survive a crisis or leave to settle somewhere else, the genetic future of their descendants depends heavily on what those few happen to carry. The result can be dramatic without being intentional. A trait that once existed in one person out of hundreds may by chance exist in one person out of 10 among the descendants of a small founding group. For blue eyes, this matters more than any myth of sudden advantage. A mutation reducing iris pigment does not need to save anyone from death to become more common. It only needs to be present in the right population at the right moment. If a band carrying the variant survives a cold phase, while another does not, the variant survives with them. If descendants of that band expand into a newly habitable valley, the variant expands too. If they remain partly isolated for many generations, marrying mostly within a small network of related communities, the trait can increase. None of this requires anyone to choose blue eyes. None of it requires blue eyes to be better. It requires only the ordinary unfairness of prehistory. The unfairness is important. Human survival has never been evenly distributed. A flood cuts off one settlement. A drought empties another. A disease moves along a river corridor and spares a community beyond a ridge. A hunting ground fails after animals shift their migration. A child survives because a grandmother knows a hidden food source. Another does not because a fever comes in winter. These events are invisible in most archaeological records, yet they shape ancestry as powerfully as migrations marked by tools and graves. What survives in the record suggest broad movements, but the intimate reasons one lineage continues while another vanishes often remain beyond recovery. The blue eye variant may have passed through such narrow gates many times. It may have been rare, then slightly less rare, then rare again, depending on the fortunes of the communities carrying it. In a world of small population sizes, the frequency of a trait can rise and fall like water in a cracked basin. Later observers may look at the result and search for purpose, but drift does not care about purpose. Genetic drift is the name given to random changes in variant frequency from one generation to the next. In large populations, drift is usually weaker because chance is diluted by numbers. In small populations, drift can be powerful. It can preserve what seems improbable. It can eliminate what seems useful. It is not dramatic, but over long stretches of time it is relentless. There is a lesser-known consequence of this. Some traits that feel deeply meaningful to modern people may have become visible, partly because of demographic luck. Eye color, hair color, certain blood group patterns, even some disease risks can reflect ancient bottlenecks and founder effects. This does not make them meaningless, but it changes what kind of meaning they carry. They are not always adaptations carved directly by environment. Sometimes they are fossils of population structure. They are records of who became many, who remained few, and who did not pass through the narrowing at all. In prehistoric Europe, bottlenecks were not rare accidents. They were built into the landscape of survival. Ice ages compressed habitable zones. Warming opened new territories. Rising seas erased coastal worlds. Forest expansion changed food webs. human groups repeatedly split, merged, and moved. The population of an entire region could be thin enough that a few successful families altered the genetic balance far beyond what their names, if they had names in any recoverable sense, would suggest. The evidence remains incomplete, but ancient DNA has revealed repeated episodes where later, populations are not simple continuations of earlier ones. There are turnovers, mixtures, and expansions. There are ghosts of groups that contributed little to later people, and others that contributed far more than their archaeological visibility might imply. Blue eyes fit naturally into this world of uneven inheritance. A rare iris color variant could rise among hunter-gatherers, not because it marks them as chosen by climate, but because their descendants passed through a favorable demographic channel. Later, when those descendants met incoming farmers, some of the variant entered new communities. Later still, when steppe-related groups moved across Europe, the genetic landscape shifted again. Each wave did not erase everything before it. It stirred the older ingredients into new patterns. A blue-eye variant could be diluted in one region, concentrated in another, and carried onward in ways no one intended. This is also why a single origin story must be handled carefully. If many blue-eyed people share the same regulatory variant, that does not mean the trait spread in one smooth expansion from one clearly defined homeland. A mutation can be old, its rise can be later. Its carriers can be absorbed into different populations at different times. The same variant can travel through marriages, migrations, and small founder events, like a thread passing through many fabrics. By the time written history begins to notice eye color, the deeper process has already been unfolding for thousands of years in silence. The social life of small groups may have amplified the process further. Humans do not mate randomly, even in the simplest societies. People form bonds through kinship, alliance, distance, custom, preference, obligation, and sometimes capture or coercion. A rare visible trait can become clustered if its carriers marry within a related network. It can also spread outward if marriages connect distant bands. Scholars still debate how much visible preference mattered in the rise of blue eyes, and the evidence cannot be read directly from bones alone. But even without strong preference, ordinary social structure would shape inheritance. Who is considered kin, who is considered marriageable, who moves after partnership, and who remains close to parents all affect the fate of a variant. There is something almost unsettling in this. Blue eyes, so often treated in later cultures as symbols of beauty, foreignness, innocence, danger, nobility, coldness, or mystery, may owe much of their early survival to events with no symbolic meaning at all. A storm, a famine, a small group crossing into open land, a few children living long enough to become parents. The great visible difference begins in invisible arithmetic. The eye catches attention, but the cause may be buried in population size, and yet chance alone may not be the whole story. It rarely is. Once a trait becomes visible, human perception enters the process. People notice difference. They attach meanings to it. They may favor it, fear it, ignore it, or fold it into stories about ancestry and belonging. Even before cities, kings, and written myths, human communities are social worlds dense with attention. A face is never merely a face. It is a signal of kin, stranger, age, health, mood, and memory. A rare eye color could have carried social consequences long before anyone left a written trace. What those consequences were is uncertain, and no responsible account can pretend otherwise. But the possibility remains, so the bottleneck explains how blue eyes could rise without needing to be useful. Founder effects explain how a rare variant could become locally common. Drift explains why inheritance can move in strange directions. But these forces do not act in an empty world. They act inside human lives, inside migrations, inside meetings, between groups who bring different ancestries into contact. The next great transformation does not come from the eye itself. It comes from foodland and movement. When farming enters Europe, and later when steppe herders sweep into the continent's genetic story, the old hunter-gatherer world changes forever. The blue-eye variant does not vanish in that transformation. It travels through it. The old hunter-gatherer world does not end in one season. It thins, shifts, resists, merges, and survives in fragments. Across Europe, forests still hold people whose ancestors have known those rivers, coasts, and hunting grounds for generations beyond counting. They understand the movement of deer through woodland, the timing of fish, runs the hidden value of nuts, roots, shells, and birds' eggs. Their tools are small, efficient, and adapted to a world of mobility and close environmental knowledge. Their lives are not simple, and they are not waiting passively for history to begin. History is already there in every campfire, burial ornament, and path through the trees. But from the southeast, another way of living begins to move toward them, slow at first, and then with consequences that become impossible to contain. Farming enters Europe from Anatolia and the Aegean world, carried by people who bring domesticated plants, animals, pottery traditions, new settlement patterns, and new pressures on land. Wheat, barley, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs alter the human relationship with time. A hunter-gatherer follows seasonal abundance. A farmer waits for fields. A mobile group can move when a place fails. A farming village has roots in soil storage boundaries and inheritance. This does not make farming instantly easier. Early farmers work hard, suffer disease burdens from living near animals, and sometimes face poor nutrition compared with varied forager diets. But farming can support larger populations. Larger populations can expand, absorb, displace, or surround smaller ones. Over centuries, that demographic weight changes the continent. The arrival is not a simple replacement. In some regions, early farming communities spread rapidly along river valleys and fertile corridors. In others, they stall for generations near hunter-gatherer frontiers. Sometimes the two worlds exchange goods, genes, and practices. Sometimes they remain separate. Sometimes violence appears in the record, though not always clearly. A burned settlement, a mass grave, a skull wound, a fortified village all can suggest conflict, but the evidence remains incomplete and must be read carefully. What is clear is that Europe becomes a contact zone. The descendants of long-established hunter-gatherers meet people whose ancestry, diet, technologies, and social rhythms differ from their own. In that meeting, genes move. This is where blue eyes enter a wider current. If the blue eye-associated variant is present among some western or northern hunter-gatherers, the spread of farming does not erase it completely. Instead, it becomes part of the mixture. Early Anatolian farmers appear in broad genetic terms to have carried more variants associated with lighter skin than many older European hunter-gatherers, but blue eyes were not necessarily common among them. The result is one of the great surprises of ancient DNA traits now imagined as belonging together, did not spread together in one neat package. The farmer may bring lighter skin-associated alleles. The hunter-gatherer may contribute blue-eye variants. Later populations inherit both, but not always in the same proportions or at the same time. For a long while, Europe is a patchwork. Farming villages spread across central and western regions, but hunter-gatherer ancestry persists sometimes at low levels, sometimes more strongly. Along coasts and in forests less attractive to early agriculture, foraging communities continue. In some places, farmers and hunter-gatherers live near each other for centuries, close enough to exchange objects and perhaps partners distant enough to remain culturally distinct. Archaeology hints at this uneasy nearness through pottery tools, burial customs, and isotopic evidence of diet. Ancient DNA adds another layer, showing that mixture is neither uniform nor immediate. Scholars still debate the social mechanisms behind it. Was intermarriage peaceful? Was it selective? Did women move more often than men, or the reverse in some regions? The bones do not answer every question. Then, after farming has already changed much of Europe, another transformation comes from the east. Steppe-related pastoralist groups associated in broad archaeological terms with cultures such as Yamnaya and later corded ware expansions move westward from the Pontic-Caspian steppe and surrounding regions during the 3rd millennium BCE. They bring ancestry that becomes a major component in many later European populations. They also bring new forms of mobility tied to herding wagons, perhaps early Indo-European languages and social structures that leave strong marks in burial traditions. Again, the story is debated in detail, and no single model explains every region. But the genetic impact is unmistakable. In parts of northern and central Europe, steppe-related ancestry becomes substantial, sometimes rapidly. This movement further reshapes the fate of eye colour. Steppe populations likely carried their own pigmentation patterns, including variants associated with lighter skin and in some groups light eyes or hair at varying frequencies. As they mix with farmer-descended and hunter-gatherer-descended populations, Europe's genetic map changes again. The blue eye variant already present in some lineages now moves through new networks of ancestry. It may rise in frequency in certain regions through a combination of drift selection and demographic expansion. It may be carried by people whose languages, burial customs, and social identities differ from those of earlier carriers. By the Bronze Age, the biological ingredients that later become familiar in Northern Europe are increasingly recombined, though still unevenly distributed. A lesser-known detail is that these movements can be seen not only in DNA but also in the chemistry of bones and teeth. Isotope analysis can show whether a person grew up in the same geological region where they were buried, because tooth enamel preserves chemical signatures from childhood water and food. In some prehistoric cemeteries, individuals buried with the same community show different origins, suggesting movement across landscapes during life. This matters because migration is not always a mass of people sweeping visibly across a map. Sometimes it's a bride moving to another valley, a herder joining a distant group, a child raised far from where they are buried, a family line carried by a few mobile individuals. Such movements are small in human terms but enormous in genetic consequence. The spread of farming and herding also changes population density, and density changes inheritance. In a continent of small forager bands, a rare trait can drift upward locally. In a continent of growing villages and pastoral networks, the same trait can move farther and faster through expanding populations. The blue eye variant is no longer confined only to isolated bands, if it ever was. It can enter larger reproductive pools. It can be carried along with cultural expansions. It can persist through admixture even when the original community that carried it is transformed beyond recognition. This is one reason physical traits are poor witnesses of cultural identity. A blue-eyed person in one period may belong to a forager group, in another to a farming village, in another to a steppe-descended pastoral community. The eye colour remains visible, but the world around it changes completely. This also complicates any attempt to tie blue eyes to one people or one dramatic origin myth. Europe's later appearance is not the product of a single ancestral source. It is layered from hunter-gatherers, Anatolian-related farmers, steppe pastoralists, and later migrations with regional differences that remain strong. Scandinavia is not Iberia. Ireland is not the Balkans. The Baltic is not the Mediterranean. Even within small regions, ancient burials can reveal surprising diversity. What survives in the record suggests a continent repeatedly remade not by one wave washing clean over another, but by sediment building on sediment. For the Blue Eye story, the crucial point is continuity through transformation. The trait survives the arrival of farming. It survives the demographic upheavals of the Bronze Age. It becomes woven into populations that are no longer purely hunter-gatherer-farmer or steppe pastoralist, because real human populations do not remain pure anything for long. They exchange bodies, goods, diseases, songs, tools, burial rites, and ancestors. The old mutation, once perhaps rare in a small world of forest camps and glacial shadows, now passes through villages herding roots and expanding kin networks. It is still just a small change in iris pigmentation, but it has entered history's larger bloodstream. By the time written civilizations begin to notice the peoples of Europe at the edges of their maps, the deeper genetic drama is already ancient. Farmers have cleared forests, herders have crossed open plains, coastal worlds have drowned, languages have spread and vanished. The Blue Eye variant has moved through all of this without leaving its own monuments. Its monument is the human face. And the next clues come not from myth or memory, but from the dead themselves, from skeletons lifted out of caves, bogs, graves, and ancient soils whose DNA has begun to speak in ways no old chronicle ever could. For most of modern history, the dead kept their oldest secrets well. Archaeologists could measure bones, study tools, map graves, compare pottery and reconstruct diets from teeth and isotopes. But the bodies themselves remained stubbornly quiet about many of the traits people most wanted to imagine. A skull could suggest ancestry in broad and often misleading ways. A burial could reveal status injury, food ritual, or movement. A preserved lock of hair might offer colour if survival was unusually kind. But the living face was mostly gone. The eyes most fragile of all vanished quickly. No blue, brown, grey or green remained in the sockets. The past stared back as absence. Ancient DNA changed that silence. Slowly at first and then with extraordinary force, researchers learned how to recover fragments of genetic material from old bones and teeth, especially from dense parts of the skeleton, where DNA can persist for thousands of years under favourable conditions. The petrous portion of the temporal bone deep near the inner ear became especially valuable because it can preserve DNA better than many other skeletal parts. This is one of the lesser-known details behind the revolution. Some of the most intimate discoveries about ancient human appearance come from a hard-hidden piece of bone no one would have associated with eye colour in earlier generations. From such fragments, scientists began to reconstruct not portraits but probabilities. They could estimate ancestry, relatedness, sex, lactase, persistence, disease markers, and sometimes pigmentation traits. The results unsettled old assumptions almost immediately. Ancient Europe was not a simple continent of pale people slowly becoming modern. It was a shifting mosaic. Some hunter-gatherers carried genetic variants associated with dark skin and dark hair, while also carrying variants linked to blue eyes. Some early farmers carried lighter skin-associated variants, but different eye colour patterns. Later, steppe-related groups added still more ancestry and pigmentation combinations. The familiar modern bundle of light skin, light eyes, and sometimes light hair did not appear all at once as a single ancient uniform. It was assembled through time unevenly region by region, as populations met and mixed. One of the most widely discussed examples comes from Mesolithic Western Europe, where remains from hunter-gatherer contexts suggested a combination that startled the public darker skin pigmentation markers with blue eye-associated variants. This does not mean scientists can restore the exact face with perfect confidence. Pigmentation prediction from ancient DNA is probabilistic, and scholars still debate how some genetic markers translate into actual appearance, especially in ancient populations whose trait combinations differ from modern reference groups. But the broad implication remains powerful. The past does not obey modern stereotypes. A person with blue eyes did not necessarily have pale skin. A person with lighter skin did not necessarily have blue eyes. The traits moved along different genetic paths before later history brought them together more often. This matters because it turns blue eyes from a symbol into evidence. Not evidence of superiority, purity, or any of the dangerous fantasies later attached to human appearance, but evidence of deep mixture and unexpected inheritance. A blue eye variant in an ancient skeleton can reveal connections between groups that may not be visible from artifacts alone. It can show that a trait survived in communities whose cultures have vanished. It can complicate neat migration stories. It can remind us that identity in prehistory was not written in the same categories people use now. The skeletons also show that Europe's genetic landscape changed dramatically after the Ice Age. Western hunter-gatherers, Eastern hunter-gatherers, Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, Anatolian-related farmers and steppe pastoralists all contributed in different ways to later populations. These labels are modern scientific conveniences, not tribes with clean borders. They name clusters of ancestry, not living cultures in their full complexity. But they help reveal a pattern the continent was repeatedly reshaped. The people buried in one region at one time may not be the main ancestors of the people living there a few thousand years later. In other places, continuity is stronger. The evidence remains incomplete because preservation is uneven and sampling is still limited, but the broad lesson is already unavoidable. Europe was made by movement. Eye color travels inside that movement. Ancient DNA from the Baltic and surrounding northern regions suggests that light eye variants became common in some hunter-gatherer populations. Later, as farming spreads, the genetic balance shifts. In parts of Europe, early farmers initially carry less hunter-gatherer ancestry, but over time, farmer communities absorb more local ancestry, and with it certain traits. Steppe expansions then alter the picture again. By the Bronze Age and afterward, the ingredients of modern European pigmentation patterns are more widely distributed, though never uniform. The blue eye story is therefore not a straight line from one mutation to one modern people. It is a network of inheritances crossing through bodies that belong to very different worlds. There is a quiet human intimacy in this science that can be easy to miss. A tooth found in a cave may belong to someone who watched smoke curl under a rock shelter roof. A skeleton in a crouched burial may belong to a person carried there by relatives who understood death through beliefs now lost. A skull from a lakeshore settlement may have belonged to someone who knew the sound of winter ice, cracking the smell of fish, drying the pressure of hunger before spring. When geneticists analyze these remains, the result is often a table of variance percentages and probabilities. Yet behind every data point was a life with weather pain, appetite, fear, and attachment. The eye color is only a trace, but traces matter when almost everything else is gone. Ancient DNA also warns against overconfidence. The samples available to science are not evenly distributed across time or space. Cold climates preserve DNA better than hot, wet environments. Some regions have been excavated more intensively than others. Some burial customs preserve bodies well, others leave little behind. Political boundaries, funding soil chemistry, and chance all shape what researchers can study. This means any map of ancient traits is partly a map of preservation and discovery. Scholars still debate many details, and new findings can revise old models quickly. A single well-preserved cemetery can alter the picture of a region. A new sequencing method can pull information from remains once thought useless. The past is not finished speaking. Even with those cautions, the skeletons have already done something extraordinary. They have separated blue eyes from myth. They have shown that the trait is older and stranger in Europe than once imagined. They have revealed that the rise of blue eyes cannot be explained by simply pointing to modern Northern Europeans and projecting them backward. They have shown that ancient appearance was a shifting arrangement of features, each with its own history. They have turned the question from what people had blue eyes into, how did this trait move through changing populations, and why did it persist when so many other ancient lineages faded? The answer remains layered. Some of it is drift, some of it is migration, some of it may be mate choice. Some may involve selection connected to traits near the same genetic regions, though such possibilities are difficult to prove. No single explanation fully accounts for the distribution. But ancient skeletons make one point almost undeniable. Blue eyes survived because the people carrying them were part of Europe's deepest transformations. They was not outside history. They were inside it, moving through ice retreat, forest expansion, farming frontiers, steppe migrations, and the long formation of later societies. When those skeletons speak, they do not speak in a single voice. They murmur from caves in Iberia, forests in Scandinavia, river valleys in Central Europe, cemeteries on the steppe, and settlements long dissolved into soil. They say that the human face is a palimpsest written over again and again. They say that what seems familiar now was once surprising. They say that a blue gaze may carry not one origin, but the memory of many crossings. And once that gaze becomes visible enough in living populations, another force may begin to work upon it. The force of human attention, preference, beauty, and uncertainty. Once blue eyes become visible often enough for people to notice them, the story enters more uncertain territory. Genes move through bodies, but bodies live inside social worlds. A rare eye color is not like a hidden enzyme or a silent blood marker. It looks back. It appears in the face in the moment of recognition, in the intimate distance between parent and child, between strangers, between possible partners. A visible trait can become part of how people remember one another. It can be admired, ignored, distrusted, desired, mocked, or folded into ideas of kinship and difference. And because human beings are not only biological creatures but storytelling animals, even a small variation in the iris may gather meanings around itself long before anyone writes those meanings down. This is where theories of sexual selection often enter the explanation. The basic idea is simple enough if a rare trait is considered attractive, or if it helps an individual stand out in mate choice, then people carrying it may have more children, and the trait may spread. In some versions of the theory, blue eyes become common in parts of Europe because they were unusual and therefore noticeable, especially in small populations where rarity itself could create appeal. In other versions, light eyes may have been favoured because they made emotional signals or pupil changes more visible, though this remains difficult to prove. The possibility is intriguing, but the evidence remains incomplete. Human attraction is complicated even in the present, where it can be studied directly. Reconstructing attraction in prehistoric communities from genes and bones is far more uncertain. Still, sexual selection cannot be dismissed entirely. Many traits in animals persist or expand not because they help survival in a direct way, but because they influence mating. Bright feathers, elaborate songs, antlers, colours, scents, and displays can all become important if potential mates respond to them. Humans are different in many ways, but not exempt from mate choice. Faces matter. Symmetry, health cues, age, familiarity, novelty, status, skill, and social approval all shape attraction. A rare eye colour could have entered that web of preference. It might have signalled difference. It might have been associated with certain families. It might have become desirable in one community and meaningless in another. Scholars still debate whether this kind of preference played a significant role in the rise of blue eyes, and no responsible account should pretend the matter is settled. The most cautious view is that mate choice may have amplified a trait already made visible by drift and founder effects. In other words, chance may have lifted blue eyes from extreme rarity to noticeable presence, and then human preference may have helped maintain or increase them in some places. This avoids the trap of making beauty the sole engine of the story. Blue eyes did not need to conquer Europe because everyone found them irresistible. That is too simple, too modern, and too close to the myths later societies built around appearance. But once a visible trait becomes common enough to be recognized and rare enough to stand out, it can acquire social weight. Human eyes are not hidden. They are central to attention. There is a lesser-known complication here. Preferences often depend on frequency. A trait that is rare can seem striking. If it becomes too common, the advantage of novelty disappears. Some evolutionary models suggest that rare, visible traits can be maintained by frequency-dependent selection, where unusual appearances receive more attention simply because they are unusual. This has sometimes been proposed for the diversity of human hair and eye colour in Europe, yet these models are difficult to test against ancient reality. Prehistoric mate choice did not leave surveys. It left descendants, and descendants are shaped by many forces at once. What survives in the record suggests possible room for preference, not proof of a single prehistoric beauty standard. Modern assumptions make this especially dangerous. Today, blue eyes can carry strong cultural associations in some societies because art, literature, colonial history, nationalism, film and advertising have amplified them. Projecting those associations backward would be a mistake. A Mesolithic forager did not see through the eyes of a modern fashion magazine. A Neolithic farmer did not inherit the symbolism of later European courts. A Bronze Age herder did not think in the categories invented by modern racial ideology. If blue eyes were preferred in some prehistoric communities, the reasons may have been local, subtle, and unlike anything later societies imagined. They may have been tied to family resemblance, clan, identity, rarity, perceived vitality, or simply individual attraction. Or they may not have mattered much at all. The uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. Blue eyes survive at the meeting point of what can be measured and what cannot. Genes can tell us where a variant appears. Ancient DNA can estimate its frequency in sampled populations. Demographic models can test whether drift alone might explain its rise. But desire leaves faint traces. A person buried with ornaments may have been loved, feared, respected, or ritually prepared, according to rules we no longer understand. A child with unusual eyes may have been cherished like any child, or singled out, or never treated differently at all. The silence around these details keeps the mystery human. Even in historic periods where written sources exist, eye colour is rarely described neutrally. It is usually filtered through symbolism. Light eyes can be linked with beauty, coldness, foreignness, divinity, danger, or strangeness, depending on who is writing and about whom. Ancient authors sometimes describe the appearance of northern peoples in ways that mix observation with stereotype. Medieval and early modern texts attach moral meaning to physical traits with little consistency. Such sources tell us more about cultural imagination than genetic history. They remind us that visible differences quickly become stories, and stories can outgrow facts. There is another possibility quieter than beauty, but perhaps more powerful: recognition. In small communities, unusual traits can mark kin lines. If several members of a family have pale eyes, the trait becomes part of how that family is known. It can help people identify relatedness, belonging, and descent even without formal genealogy. This does not require admiration. It requires memory. Human groups are deeply attentive to inheritance. They notice a grandfather's hands in a child, a mother's hair, a familiar walk, a repeated expression. Eye color can become one of those remembered features. Through such attention, a mutation becomes socially visible, even if it has no direct advantage. But visibility can cut both ways. Difference is not always favored. It can also invite suspicion. In some societies, unusual appearance may be considered powerful or ominous. In others, it may be absorbed without concern. The first blue-eyed individuals could have experienced any number of reactions, and the evidence cannot recover them. This is why stories that claim blue eyes spread purely because they were considered beautiful should be treated carefully. They may contain a plausible mechanism, but they often smuggle in modern values. The better explanation remains: layered drift creates frequency bottlenecks, magnify it. Migrations move it, and human preference may shape it once it becomes visible. The eye itself adds to the effect because eyes carry emotional force in human interaction. People look at eyes to read attention, fear, anger, illness, affection, and intent. A lighter iris can make the pupil more visually distinct in some lighting, and this has led to speculation that blue eyes might alter the perceived intensity of gaze. But again, speculation is not proof. No single explanation fully accounts for why the trait became common in some regions and not others. The most honest answer is that blue eyes probably persisted through a combination of forces, with different forces mattering more in different times and places, and that in a way is more interesting than a simple answer. A blue gaze is not a survival tool like a spear point, not an adaptation as clear as lactose tolerance in dairying populations, not a cultural invention like pottery. It is a biological variation that becomes entangled with chance and perception. It exists because chemistry permits it, because small populations preserved it, because migrations carried it, and perhaps because human beings noticed it when they looked into one another's faces. The mystery is not that blue eyes are magical. The mystery is that something so small could pass through so much history and remain bright enough to be seen. Yet one popular explanation still waits in the background, repeated because it feels intuitive. The north is dark, so people there became pale-eyed. It sounds reasonable at first. It is also far too simple. To understand why the story must turn from desire and chance back to sunlight, vitamin D, and the myths people build when they confuse one kind of pigment with another, the most familiar explanation is also the easiest one to believe. Blue eyes became common in the north, because northern Europe is dark. The sun sits lower there. Winters are long. Clouds can cover the sky for days. Snow fog and cold rain turn the landscape pale and muted. If light skin can be explained partly through the need for vitamin D in low ultraviolet environments, then perhaps light eyes are simply part of the same adaptation. The idea feels tidy. It gives the trait a purpose. It turns a strange color into an environmental solution. But human biology is rarely that tidy, and in this case the explanation begins to weaken as soon as the details are examined. Vitamin D is made when ultraviolet light reaches the skin and begins a chain of chemical reactions. In regions with strong sunlight, dark skin protects against excess ultraviolet radiation, while still allowing enough vitamin D production. In regions with weaker sunlight, especially at high latitudes, lighter skin can help the body produce vitamin D more efficiently. This does not mean skin color is determined by sunlight alone. Diet, migration, clothing, culture, and ancestry all complicate the picture. Coastal populations eating vitamin D-rich fish may face different pressures from inland farmers. People wearing heavy clothing may receive less sun even when they live in bright places. Scholars still debate many details, but the connection between skin pigmentation and ultraviolet exposure has a strong biological foundation. Eye color does not work the same way. The iris is not a vitamin D factory. Making the iris lighter does not solve the problem of weak northern sunlight in the body. A person does not produce meaningful vitamin D through blue eyes. If anything, lower iris pigmentation can make bright light more uncomfortable, especially in environments with glare from water ice or snow. This does not mean blue eyes are harmful in any dramatic sense. Most people with blue eyes live perfectly ordinary lives. But it does mean that the simple argument from darkness is not enough. Northern light may help explain some aspects of skin pigmentation, but does not automatically explain blue irises. The confusion comes from treating light skin, light hair, and light eyes as a single package. In modern Northern Europe, these traits often appear together, so it is tempting to assume they arose together for the same reason. Ancient DNA shows otherwise. The package was assembled over time. Early hunter-gatherers in parts of Europe could carry blue eye-associated variants without the full suite of later light pigmentation. Early farmers could carry lighter skin variants without blue eyes being especially common. Steppe-related groups added other components. The modern pattern is real, but it is not ancient in a simple way. It is a historical mixture, not a single adaptation born whole under a northern sky. There is also a global problem for the darkness explanation. Many populations live or have lived at high latitudes without blue eyes becoming common in the same way. Indigenous peoples of the Arctic northern Asia and the Americas adapted to cold darkness, snow glare and seasonal extremes through many biological and cultural strategies, yet blue eyes did not become a dominant trait among them. Diet, ancestry, population history, and founder effect differ across these regions, but that is exactly the point. If northern darkness alone produced blue eyes, we would expect a much broader and more predictable pattern. Instead, the distribution is strongly tied to particular histories of ancestry in Western Eurasia and its descendants. Another popular idea links blue eyes to better vision in low light. This too sounds plausible until treated carefully. Eye color can influence light sensitivity and glare, but there is no strong evidence that blue eyes gave ancient northern people a decisive advantage in twilight forests or winter gloom. The pupil retina lens and neural processing of vision do far more to determine low-light seeing than iris color alone. A blue iris may allow more stray light scatter, not necessarily clearer vision. The evidence remains incomplete, but no mainstream explanation treats blue eyes as a major adaptation for seeing in the dark. The trait spread must be explained elsewhere. Snow glare offers another complication. Northern landscapes are not always dim. A clear winter day over snow can be painfully bright. Sunlight reflects from ice and water with stunning force. Darker irises can help absorb excess light and reduce scattering. This is one reason the idea of blue eyes as a northern visual adaptation is not straightforward. The north contains darkness, yes, but also glare. It contains long winter nights and blinding spring melt. It contains forests where light is filtered through leaves and open coasts where brightness flashes from waves. No single lighting condition dominates enough to make blue eyes an obvious solution, yet sunlight may still hover around the story indirectly. The same broad environments that favored lighter skin in some populations also shaped the demographic world in which blue eyes spread. High-latitude populations were often smaller, more isolated and more vulnerable to bottlenecks during climatic shifts. Seasonal pressures affected diet settlement and movement. Farming at northern latitudes brought nutritional stresses that may have strengthened selection for lighter skin. As those populations expanded and mixed, blue-eye variants already present in some groups could rise alongside other pigmentation traits, not because the iris itself was solving the vitamin D problem, but because the people carrying those traits shared histories. This is the more careful version. Northern environments helped shape population history, and population history helped shape eye color. There is a lesser-known detail in the biology of pigmentation that deepens this point. Melanin is not a single-purpose substance. It influences skin, hair, eyes, and even aspects of development in different ways through networks of genes that can have varied effects depending on tissue. A mutation that affects iris pigmentation may not affect skin in the same way. A variant that changes hair color may not produce the same eye color. Pigmentation is modular enough for traits to become recombined but connected enough that selection on one trait can sometimes influence the frequency of nearby or related variants. This creates room for complex outcomes. A trait may hitchhike with another variant under selection, or become common because it travels through a population expanding for reasons unrelated to eye color itself. No single explanation fully accounts for this web. The myths persist because humans like visible traits to have visible reasons. Blue eyes look like northern skies, so people imagine they came from northern skies. Pale skin helps in weaker ultraviolet light, so pale eyes must do something similar. But resemblance is not evidence. The body does not adapt by poetry. It adapts through reproduction, survival, inheritance, and chance. Sometimes the result looks symbolic only after the fact. This does not make blue eyes meaningless. It makes them more historically interesting. They are not merely an environmental adjustment. They are a clue to ancient population structure. Their presence in a living person points very distantly and imperfectly toward ancestors who passed through particular Western Eurasian histories: hunter-gatherer, survival, farming, expansion, steppe migration, bottleneck drift mixture, and perhaps mate choice. The color is visible, but the reason is buried. That is why it has attracted so many simple stories and why the simple stories fail. Even the phrase blue eyes can mislead. The actual range includes pale grey, deep blue, blue-green, and shades that shift with light clothing, pupil size, and surrounding colour. Some eyes called blue contain small amounts of yellowish or brownish pigment. Some appear grey because of differences in collagen structure and scattering. Some change dramatically depending on the environment. This variability reminds us again that we are not dealing with painted objects. We are dealing with living tissues and optical effects, so northern darkness alone cannot explain blue eyes. Vitamin D cannot explain them directly. Better night vision cannot explain them convincingly. Snow forest and cloud do not solve the puzzle. The answer remains in the layered forces already gathering behind the story mutation: reduced iris melanin drift in small populations, migration, mixture, and human attention. The North is part of the stage but not the author, and once that is understood, the mystery moves inward. The visible blue has never been a pigment sitting in the iris like ink. It is the result of light entering a low melanin structure and returning change to the viewer. The colour that has inspired myths, preferences, suspicions, and entire false histories is at its core a physical illusion. To see why blue eyes exist, one must look not only at ancient migrations, but at the strange way an eye can seem to contain a colour it does not truly possess. The strange truth about blue eyes is that they're not blue in the way many people imagine. There is no blue pigment stored in the iris, no tiny reservoir of colour, no biological dye painted across the eye. A brown eye is brown because melanin absorbs and reflects light in a way that produces a rich, dark appearance. A blue eye, by contrast, is blue largely because it lacks enough melanin in the front layer of the iris to hide the way light scatters through its structure. The colour is not placed there like paint on wood. It is produced in the moment of seeing. This makes blue eyes closer to the colour of the sky than to the colour of a flower petal. The sky is not filled with blue material. It appears blue because molecules in the atmosphere scatter shorter wavelengths of sunlight more strongly than longer wavelengths. The iris is not the atmosphere, and the physics is not identical in every detail, but the comparison helps. In a low pigment iris, light enters the tissue, interacts with its microscopic structure, and shorter wavelengths are scattered back toward the observer. The result is the colour humans call blue. It is an event between light tissue and perception. Change the lighting, and the same eyes may look grey, pale blue, icy dark, or nearly colourless. The iris itself is a living landscape. It is not a flat disc. It has layers, fibres, folds, crypts, ridges, and muscle structures that control the pupil. It expands and contracts constantly as light changes. In darker eyes, melanin in the front layers absorbs much of the scattered light, giving the iris a brown appearance. In lighter eyes, less melanin allows scattering to dominate. That is why two people with blue eyes may not have the same shade. The amount of pigment density of tissue collagen structure and light conditions all shape the final appearance. The evidence remains incomplete when it comes to predicting every subtle shade from genetics alone, because eye color is not a simple switch from brown to blue. It is a spectrum created by biology and optics together. This is one reason infants can seem to change eye color after birth. Many babies of European ancestry are born with light-colored eyes that darken over time as melanin production increases in the iris. The change can unfold over months or even years. A newborn's pale eyes do not always remain blue because the pigment system is still developing. This detail is easy to overlook, but it shows how active the eye is as a biological tissue. Eye color is not always fixed at the first moment of life. It emerges as cells deposit pigment, as the iris matures, and as genetic instructions play out in time. The blue eye-associated regulatory change near HERC2 and OCA2 affects how much melanin is produced in the iris, but even this major influence does not act alone. Other genes help shape whether eyes become blue, green hazel amber, or brown. Green eyes, for example, involve low to moderate melanin and additional optical effects that create a different appearance from classic blue. Hazel eyes can contain uneven pigment distribution, making them shift between brown, green, and gold depending on light. Grey eyes may involve scattering through a different tissue structure. The human eye is less like a color chart and more like weather over water, constantly changed by depth, light, and angle. This also explains why blue eyes can look so different across landscapes. In a dim room they may appear slate grey. Under open northern light they may look pale and cold. Near firelight they may seem darker, almost green. Against dark clothing they may intensify. Under harsh midday sun the pupil contracts, exposing more iris and changing the balance of colour. What people call the colour of an eye is therefore partly an interaction with the surrounding world. The same ancient person walking from a forest shadow into snow-reflected brightness might seem to carry different eyes from one moment to the next. No wonder such eyes became easy material for symbolism. They do not sit still. The illusion, however, should not be mistaken for unreality. Blue eyes are physically real as a trait because the underlying iris structure and pigment level are real. The colour is not imaginary. It is produced by real interactions between light and tissue. Many colours in nature work this way. The blue of some bird feathers, the shining colour of certain butterfly wings, and the shifting iridescence of shells or insects can arise from microscopic structure rather than pigment alone. Nature often makes colour by shaping light instead of staining matter. Blue eyes belong to that wider family of structural colour, though in a softer and less spectacular form. There is a lesser-known irony in this. Blue is one of the rarer pigment colours in nature, yet structural blue appears again and again. Many organisms that seem blue do not contain true blue pigment. They contain surfaces that manipulate light. In humans, the blue iris is not as vivid as a morpho butterfly wing or a kingfisher feather, but the principle has a quiet kinship. The body has not manufactured blue paint. It has reduced brown pigment enough for structure to speak. This brings the story back to the phrase "shouldn't exist." Blue eyes exist because they do not require a new blue substance. They require less of an old brown one. Evolution often works like this. It modifies, reduces, redirects, and regulates what is already present. The mutation associated with many blue eyes does not invent a new color system. It adjusts the amount of melanin in one tissue, and physics does the rest. A small genetic change becomes a visible transformation because the eye is already a delicate optical organ. There is no need for nature to create blue from scratch, but the same reduced melanin that creates the blue appearance also shapes how the eye responds to light. People with lighter irises may experience more sensitivity to bright conditions, though individual variation is large. The iris has less pigment to absorb stray light, which can make glare more noticeable. This does not mean blue eyes are fragile in a dramatic sense, and it does not mean ancient blue-eyed people were at a severe disadvantage. It simply means the trait has consequences. Beauty, if later societies call it that, is not separate from biology. It comes with trade-offs, however subtle. The optical nature of blue eyes also explains why they can be so culturally powerful. A brown eye presents depth through pigment. A blue eye presents depth through scattering and transparency. It can seem clear, cold, watery, glass-like, or bright, depending on context. These impressions are not scientific truth about character, though cultures have often treated them as if they were. They are perceptual effects. Human beings are extremely sensitive to faces, and the eyes are the center of that sensitivity. A rare optical effect in the gaze is almost guaranteed to collect stories, yet the stories came much later than the mutation. Long before poets, painters, or pseudoscientists tried to attach meanings to eye color, the physical process was already happening in ordinary human bodies. A child's iris held less melanin. Light scattered. Someone noticed. That was all. The ancient world did not need a theory of wavelengths for the effect to matter. It only needed eyes meeting eyes. The biology of blue illusion therefore deepens the historical mystery rather than reducing it. The trait is not a magical adaptation, not a northern necessity, not a marker of one pure ancestry. It is a subtle genetic regulation, expressed through the physics of light. It survived because populations carried it. It spread because history opened paths. It became meaningful because humans notice faces. The blue itself is almost insubstantial, made fresh each time light enters the iris and returns. And because it is made through reduced pigment, the story cannot avoid the question of consequence. What happens when the eye carries less melanin? Does it change risk? Does it change sensitivity? Does it leave people more exposed to certain conditions? The answers are real, but they must be handled carefully. A visible trait can invite exaggeration as easily as admiration. Blue eyes are neither a curse nor a superpower. They are a variation, and like many variations, they carry small biological costs, small associations, and a long history of misunderstanding. A trait that survives does not have to be perfect. It only has to be survivable. Blue eyes are a useful reminder of this because they are neither a disaster nor an obvious advantage. They sit in the complicated middle ground where many human variations live. They alter the way the iris handles light. They change appearance. They may carry small associations with certain risks, but they do not define a person's health, fate, strength, or worth. The danger in talking about visible traits is that people often exaggerate them, turning small biological differences into sweeping myths. The real story is quieter, more precise, and more interesting. The most immediate consequence of lower iris pigment is light sensitivity. Melanin helps absorb excess light inside the eye, so people with lighter irises may be more bothered by glare, bright sun-reflected snow, or harsh artificial light. This does not mean every blue-eyed person squints through life, and it does not mean darker-eyed people never experience sensitivity. Human eyes vary in many ways, but on average lighter eyes can allow more stray light scattering, which may make brightness feel sharper. In ancient landscapes, this could have been mildly inconvenient at times, especially near snowfields, pale stone, open water, or winter glare. Yet inconvenience is not the same as strong selection against a trait. If the cost is small, a variant can persist easily, especially when carried by successful populations. Some medical studies have found associations between lighter eye colour and higher risk for certain eye conditions, including forms of ocular melanoma and age-related light damage. These risks are real enough to be studied, but they must be kept in proportion. They are not destiny. Environment, behaviour, ancestry, age, genetics, and chance all matter. A blue-eyed person living under strong sunlight without protection may face different risks from someone living in a cloudy climate or using shade and modern eyewear. Ancient people did not have sunglasses, but they did have cultural adaptations, shelter clothing, seasonal movement, and ordinary avoidance of unbearable glare. The evidence remains incomplete for how much eye colour risk affected prehistoric survival, and there is no strong reason to imagine blue eyes as a severe burden. There are also disputed or weakly supported claims linking eye colour to pain tolerance, alcohol sensitivity, personality, or temperament. These ideas appear often in popular writing because they are memorable, but many are uncertain, overstated, or based on limited evidence. Human behaviour is not written cleanly in iris colour. The same caution applies to claims that blue-eyed people are more trustworthy, colder, more sensitive, more intelligent, or more fragile. Such claims belong more to cultural storytelling than biology. The iris can scatter light. It cannot reveal the moral architecture of a human being. This distinction matters because blue eyes have often been treated as if they mean more than they do. A visible trait becomes a screen on which societies project values. In one context, it may be admired as rare or beautiful. In another, it may be treated as alien. In another, it may be dragged into false hierarchies of ancestry and power. Biology gives the eye its colour. Culture gives it a reputation. The two are not the same. What survives in the record suggests that humans have always noticed physical difference, but the meanings attached to those differences change with time, politics, religion, art, and fear. The biological reality is modest. Blue eyes are produced by reduced melanin in the iris. That reduction can influence light handling and may correlate with certain risks. It may also coexist with broader pigmentation patterns shaped by ancestry. But it does not form a separate kind of human. It does not mark a clean lineage. It does not carry a hidden essence. This same mutation or related variant can pass through people of many cultures, languages, and histories. The eye colour remains visible while everything around it changes. A lesser-known detail is that blue eyes can also vary in stability and appearance, because the iris itself is not evenly coloured. Some people have central heterochromia, where a ring near the pupil differs in colour from the outer iris. Others have sectoral patches, flecks, or darker rims. These features arise from the uneven pigment distribution and iris structure. They remind us again that eye colour is not a simple category but a living pattern. The word blue often covers a whole range of biological arrangements from pale grey blue to deeper blue with gold or green elements. Modern forms and passports flatten this complexity into a checkbox. The eye itself refuses to be so simple. In evolutionary terms, the costs of blue eyes appear small enough that drift migration and mate choice could overcome them. A trait with a slight disadvantage can still spread if demographic forces favour its carriers. A trait with no advantage can become common if it rides with expanding populations. A trait with mild costs can persist if those costs usually appear late in life after reproduction, or only under certain environmental conditions. This is one reason evolution does not produce perfectly optimized beings. It produces workable compromises. The human body is full of them, backs prone to pain, teeth crowded by changing diets, immune systems that protect and sometimes overreact pigmentation patterns that solve one problem while creating another. Blue eyes belong to this imperfect inventory. They are beautiful to some observers, ordinary to others, inconvenient in glare to some, medically relevant in certain contexts, and historically revealing in ways no ancient person could have known. They are not proof that evolution had a plan. They are proof that life often keeps what it can tolerate. The persistence of blue eyes also shows how weak selection against a visible trait can be if it does not strongly affect survival or reproduction. If light sensitivity caused only minor discomfort, it would not necessarily remove the trait from a population. If disease risks mostly appeared later in life or remained rare, they would exert limited pressure. If cultural or mating preferences sometimes favoured the trait even mildly, that could help balance or exceed small costs. No single explanation fully accounts for the whole distribution, but the persistence of blue eyes suggests that any disadvantages were not strong enough to erase them. There is something almost poetic in that restraint. A fragile-looking trait survives not because it is invincible, but because the world is not always harsh in the same direction. The same sunlight that makes pale eyes squint may be softened by cloud forest latitude or season. The same small risk that matters in one environment may barely matter in another. The same unusual appearance that could invite suspicion in one community may attract interest in another. Evolution is not a single storm. It is changing weather over generations. And then there is modern life, which changes the consequences again. Sunglasses, medicine, indoor work, global migration and intermarriage all alter the environment in which eye colour exists. A trait shaped in prehistoric populations now lives under electric light screens, cars, airplanes and cities. Blue eyes that once moved through forests, steppe farm villages and coastal settlements now appear in places their ancient carriers never imagined. The biological variation remains, but the world around it has become almost unrecognizable. Still, the old questions follow. Why did this trait survive? Why did humans notice it so intensely? Why did cultures turn a small optical effect into myth, omen, beauty, danger, and identity? The answers move beyond biology into memory and symbolism. Once blue eyes become common enough to be recognized across societies, they begin to gather meanings that have little to do with melanin and everything to do with how humans read faces. The next part of the story belongs not to genes alone, but to imagination. The long and uneven history of how cultures looked into pale eyes and saw far more than colour. Once a visible trait enters human imagination, it rarely remains only biology. Blue eyes begin as a matter of melanin and scattered light, but cultures do not usually stop at scattered light. They turn faces into symbols. They attach meaning to what stands out. They build stories from color distance, fear, desire, and memory. A rare gaze can become beautiful in one place, unsettling in another, noble in one tradition, dangerous in another, holy in one image, cold or inhuman in another. The eye itself has not changed. The iris still contains little pigment. Light still enters and scatters, but the human world around it begins to thicken with interpretation. In ancient societies, physical description often appears when someone is considered foreign, remarkable, threatening, or worth remembering. Writers rarely pause to describe the ordinary. They describe what marks a person as different. For Mediterranean observers, lighter eyes among northern peoples could become part of a wider image of the distant barbarian world. Tall bodies, pale skin, fair or reddish hair, strange customs, cold lands beyond the familiar centers of civilization. These descriptions are never purely scientific. They mix observation with stereotype fear, fascination, and politics. A Roman writer describing people beyond the frontier is not merely recording pigmentation. He is also defining the edge of Rome's world. This makes ancient evidence tricky. When old authors describe light eyes, they may be seeing real traits, but they are also using appearance as a cultural tool. The blue-eyed stranger can become a sign of wildness, northern harshness, or martial danger. In other contexts, light eyes may be admired as striking or rare. The same color can hold opposite meanings depending on who is looking. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because most ancient people left no written description of themselves. We see through the words of elites, outsiders, conquerors, monks, poets, and chroniclers, all of whom carry assumptions. Their gaze is never neutral. Myth adds another layer. Across cultures, unusual eyes often suggest power because eyes are already charged with meaning. They see reveal, bless curse, seduce judge, and betray emotion. A bright or pale eye can be imagined as otherworldly, not because it is biologically otherworldly, but because it disrupts expectation. In places where dark eyes are overwhelmingly common, a blue or grey gaze may seem ghost-like, divine, foreign, or unlucky. In places where blue eyes are common, the same trait may feel ordinary and lose much of its symbolic force. Meaning follows rarity as much as colour. Medieval Europe inherits and reshapes these associations. In religious art, saints, angels, nobles, and biblical figures are often painted according to local ideals rather than historical reality. Blue eyes can appear in sacred imagery, not because ancient Judea was full of northern European faces, but because artists translate holiness into the visual language of their own world. Over centuries, this creates a feedback loop. The trait becomes linked in some regions with purity, heavenliness, or innocence, not through biology but through paint, manuscript, illumination, stained glass, and devotional imagination. A pigment choice on a panel can become a cultural memory. At the same time, blue eyes are not always treated gently. Pale eyes can be associated with coldness, deceit, illness, witchcraft, or foreign blood in different traditions. Folklore is inconsistent because human fear is inconsistent. The unusual can be blessed or cursed depending on the story that needs telling. A stranger with bright eyes may be desirable in one tale and dangerous in another. A child with unexpected colouring may be seen as marked by fate, ancestry, or supernatural interference. These ideas reveal more about social anxiety than about the people who carried the trait. One lesser-known thread is how eye colour becomes entangled with class and regional identity. In societies where certain appearances are common among ruling or invading groups, traits can acquire prestige or resentment. Where they are associated with outsiders, they can become signs of danger or fascination. In places shaped by migration, conquest, slavery or trade, Blue eyes may appear in families where they complicate social categories. A person's gaze can become evidence in stories about ancestry, legitimacy, purity, betrayal, or belonging. The eye becomes a document people think they can read even when they misread it badly. This misreading becomes far more dangerous in the modern era when visible traits are pulled into racial theories and nationalist myths. Blue eyes, along with light skin and blonde hair, are falsely elevated by some ideologies into signs of superiority or ancient purity. These claims are not supported by mainstream genetics, archaeology, or anthropology. They collapse under the evidence of ancient mixture shared ancestry and the complex history of pigmentation traits. Blue eyes do not mark a separate humankind. They do not prove cultural achievement. They do not carry moral value. They are a variation produced by genetic regulation and population history. But false stories can be powerful even when they are wrong, especially when they flatter identity. Ancient DNA has made those false stories harder to defend. It shows that the traits later mythologized as pure were assembled through mixture. It shows that early blue-eyed individuals may not have matched modern racial fantasies at all. It shows that Europe's population history is layered with hunter-gatherer-farmer steppe and later contributions. It shows that visible features cross cultural boundaries and survive in unexpected combinations. What survives in the record suggests not purity but movement, not isolation but contact, not a single ancestral essence but repeated human entanglement, and yet the symbolic power remains. In modern media, blue eyes can still be used to suggest innocence, beauty, danger, cold intelligence, supernatural mystery, aristocracy, alienness, or emotional distance. The same colour is asked to carry contradictory meanings because it remains visually striking. A camera loves contrast. A painter loves a focal point. A novelist loves a detail that can be repeated as if it explains a soul. But eyes do not explain souls. They invite projection. The long cultural history of blue eyes therefore reveals something larger about humans. We're not content to see variation as variation. We turn it into narrative. We decide that colour must mean character ancestry, must mean destiny. Appearance must reveal truth. Sometimes this produces art. Sometimes it produces prejudice. Sometimes it produces myths so persistent that science has to untangle them centuries later. The blue iris physically made from absence becomes socially filled with meanings. That is the paradox. Blue eyes are biologically modest but culturally loud. They do not contain blue pigment, yet they contain centuries of interpretation. They do not prove purity, yet they have been used in fantasies of purity. They do not reveal personality, yet they have been treated as windows into the self. They are small, fragile, and surface level, but they show how deeply humans want the body to tell stories. Still, culture is only one part of their journey. The trait does not remain fixed in northern villages, ancient cemeteries, or medieval paintings. People move, armies march, traders cross seas, empires rise, colonists travel, families are displaced, enslaved, exiled, married, absorbed, and scattered. A mutation that once found room in prehistoric Eurasia begins to appear far from its older centres. Blue eyes become not only a European story, but a global trace of migration, conquest, diaspora, and intimate human mixing. The trait that once moved through small prehistoric communities eventually begins to travel on roads, ships, horses, wagons, and later across oceans. Blue eyes do not remain locked in the regions where they become most common. No human trait does, because human beings do not stay still. Long before modern globalization, people crossed landscapes for reasons both ordinary and violent: marriage, trade, hunger, warfare, alliance, enslavement, pilgrimage, exile, settlement, and curiosity. A visible genetic inheritance can travel quietly inside these movements, appearing generations later in places where no simple map would predict it. Even within Europe, blue eyes spread unevenly through repeated layers of movement. Northern and eastern regions develop high frequencies, but the pattern is never perfectly uniform. The Baltic, Scandinavia, Ireland, parts of Britain, northern Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, Russia, and surrounding regions can show strong concentrations, while southern Europe often shows lower but still present frequencies. Mountain ranges, seas, islands, old frontiers, local marriage patterns, and later historical migrations all influence the map. It is not a clean gradient painted by climate. It is a palimpsest written by ancestry and rewritten by history. As ancient and medieval peoples move, blue eyes move with them. Germanic migrations, Slavic expansions, Viking voyages, Celtic-speaking populations, Baltic communities, steppe-descended groups, Roman-era mobility, medieval trade towns, and countless local marriages all contribute to shifting the trait across regions. Some movements are recorded in chronicles, most are not. A single marriage between communities can carry an eye colour variant into a new valley. A merchant family can leave descendants in a distant port. A soldier can father children far from home. A captive can be absorbed into another society. The evidence remains incomplete, but the genetic result is visible traits do not respect the borders later historians draw. The Viking Age offers one vivid example, though it must be handled carefully. Norse seafarers travelled, raided, traded, settled, and intermarried from the North Atlantic to river systems of Eastern Europe and beyond. Popular imagination often paints them as uniformly blue-eyed and blonde, but ancient DNA and historical evidence suggest more diversity than the stereotype allows. Still, Northern European ancestry did move through Viking routes into Britain, Ireland, Normandy, Iceland, Greenland, the Baltic, and parts of the East. In some places, this movement likely contributed to local frequencies of light eyes, but it was never a simple export of one look. The Viking world itself was mixed by trade, slavery, alliance, and travel. Even the people imagined as carriers of blue eyes were not untouched by the movements they created. Trade networks carried people farther than armies alone. Medieval and early modern ports brought together sailors, merchants, servants, captives, craftspeople, and migrants from different regions. The Hanseatic world connected northern European towns across the Baltic and North Sea. Mediterranean trade linked Europe, North Africa, Western Asia, and beyond. The Silk Roads moved goods and people across Eurasia in complex patterns. In such contact zones, ancestry could cross cultural boundaries quietly. A child born in a port city might inherit a trait from a grandparent whose own origins had already been blurred by movement. Eye colour becomes one of those small signs of a long-distance contact, though it can never tell the whole story by itself. Blue eyes also appear outside Europe through older Western Eurasian ancestry in parts of Western and Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Middle East, and North Africa, though often at lower frequencies and in highly variable patterns. Some of this reflects ancient migrations and deep population connections across Eurasia. Some reflects more recent historical mixing. In places like the Caucasus, eye colour diversity can be striking, because the region has long stood at a crossroads of mountains, empires, languages, and migrations. In parts of Central Asia, lighter eyes can appear among populations shaped by steep ancestry and later admixture. These examples remind us that blue eyes are not owned by a single modern identity. They are carried by histories. The modern global spread becomes much larger with European colonial expansion, forced migration and diaspora. From the 15th century onward, European powers move across the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Pacific, and into Africa, Asia, and the Americas through conquest, settlement, trade, and empire. Blue eyes travel with settlers, soldiers, missionaries, administrators, sailors, indentured workers, and families. They also enter populations through unequal and often violent colonial relationships. In the Americas, Australia, South Africa, and many other regions, blue eyes may appear in descendants of European settlers or in mixed ancestry populations shaped by colonial histories. The colour can look simple on the face, but the history behind it may be painful, intimate, and politically charged. This is one reason eye colour should never be treated as a clean story of ancestry. A blue-eyed person in Latin America, North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, or the Caribbean may carry the trait through many possible routes: recent European ancestry, older Western Eurasian connections, local admixture, isolated family inheritance, or combinations of these. A brown-eyed person in Scandinavia may have deep local ancestry. A blue-eyed person in one population may be culturally, linguistically, and historically unrelated to another blue-eyed person elsewhere. The eye colour alone cannot reconstruct identity. It is a clue, not a biography. A lesser-known detail is that blue eyes can reappear unexpectedly after generations because the major variants associated with the trait are recessive or partially recessive in familiar inheritance patterns. Two parents without blue eyes may still carry variants that allow a blue-eyed child depending on the combination of genes involved. Families often treat such births as mysteries, but genetically they are not unusual. The trait can hide in carriers, pass silently through generations, and emerge when two compatible sets of variants meet. This gives blue eyes a ghost-like quality in family memory. They can seem to return from nowhere when in fact they are returning from ancestry. Modern genetic testing has made people more aware of these hidden roots, though it has also created new misunderstandings. Ancestry percentages are often treated as if they directly predict appearance, but physical traits do not follow ancestry estimates in a simple way. A person can inherit a small amount of ancestry carrying a visible variant or a large amount without receiving that variant. Recombination is uneven, siblings can differ, traits can skip, blend, or surprise. The evidence of the face is real, but it is partial. The genome is far larger than what the eye displays. As blue eyes spread globally, their meanings change again. In some places they are admired because they are rare. In others they are associated with colonial power and carry ambivalence. In some families they become a treasured sign of an ancestor. In others they are simply ordinary. In popular culture they remain heavily represented, sometimes far beyond their global frequency. Films, advertisements, and digital imagery can make blue eyes seem more common than they are, especially because media industries have historically amplified European beauty standards. That amplification is cultural, not biological. It tells us about power and representation, not about the value of a trait. And still beneath all that, the old mutation continues its quiet work. A regulatory change affects iris melanin. Light scatters. The eye appears blue. Whether the person lives in Helsinki, Dublin, Istanbul, Buenos Aires, Tehran, Cape Town, Sydney, Montreal, or a small village far from any old migration map, the physical mechanism remains the same. The historical roots differ. The meanings differ. The lives differ. But the optical event is shared. The journey of blue eyes across the world is therefore not a story of one people spreading a pure inheritance. It is a story of contact. It includes voluntary movement and forced movement, love and violent settlement and displacement, isolation and mixture. It shows how a trait born from a small genetic change can become global, not because it belongs everywhere by adaptation, but because humans carry their bodies through history. The iris becomes a tiny archive of migrations too numerous to name. By the modern era, the blue eye question has changed shape. It is no longer simply how the mutation appeared or how it survived in prehistoric Europe, or how cultures interpreted it. The question becomes why it persists so strongly in some populations after all this movement, mixture, and time. The answer requires returning to all the forces at once: genetics, randomness, mate choice, demography, and the stubborn fact that evolution does not need one perfect reason for a trait to remain. Blue eyes persist because history rarely moves by one cause. The desire for a single explanation is understandable. A single answer feels satisfying. It gives the mystery a clean shape. One mutation, one place, one reason, one destiny. But the evidence does not point to anything so simple. Blue eyes are not the result of one environmental pressure, one ancient beauty standard, one migration, or one lucky family line. They are the product of many forces overlapping across thousands of years, each one strong enough to matter, none strong enough to explain everything alone. The first force is mutation. Without the genetic change that reduces melanin expression in the iris, there is no blue eye story at all. The body does not need to invent blue pigment. It only needs to reduce brown pigment enough for light scattering to become visible. This is the biological opening, the small alteration that makes the trait possible. But mutation by itself is not destiny. Most mutations vanish. They appear in one body, pass to no children, or remain rare until chance removes them. For blue eyes to persist, the mutation must pass repeatedly through generations, and that requires carriers who survive, reproduce, and enter expanding networks of ancestry. The second force is drift. In small populations, inheritance can change direction without purpose. A rare trait can become common because the families carrying it happen to leave more descendants. This is not glamorous, but it is powerful. The post-Ice Age world, with scattered groups, refugees, expansions, and local isolation, gives drift room to work. The blue eye variant may have risen in frequency, not because it helped people endure cold or darkness, but because it passed through narrow demographic gates. A few surviving families can shape the future far more than they know. The third force is founder effect. When small groups move into new regions, they carry only part of the genetic variation from their source population. If blue eye variants are present among the founders, they can become unusually common in the new group. Over time, that group may expand, split and seed other populations. What begins as a sample becomes a signature. This is one reason high frequencies in Northern and Eastern Europe may reflect not only selection, but the structure of ancient settlement itself. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the pattern fits a continent repeatedly opened and recolonized after climatic upheaval. The fourth force is migration. Hunter-gatherers, farmers, steppe herders, traders, raiders, settlers, captives, and families all move the trait. Each movement changes the map. The blue eye variant passes through cultural transformations that have nothing to do with eyes: the rise of farming, the spread of herding, the formation of villages, the movement of languages, the growth of trade networks, the violence of empire, and the dispersal of diasporas. A gene does not care what language its carrier speaks. It crosses boundaries inside bodies. The fifth force may be mate choice, though this remains the most difficult to prove. Humans notice eyes. A rare visible trait can attract attention. In some communities, blue eyes may have been favoured. In others, they may have been neutral or even unsettling. Scholars still debate the strength of sexual selection in the rise of European eye colour diversity. The safest conclusion is that preference may have contributed in some places and periods, especially after the trait became visible enough to be socially recognised. But it cannot be treated as the whole story. Beauty does not spread genes by itself. It works only through the hard realities of survival, partnership, fertility, and social structure. The sixth force is weak disadvantage. Blue eyes may bring greater light sensitivity and certain medical risk associations, but the costs are usually not strong enough to erase the trait. A variation can survive if its disadvantages are mild, late-acting, environment-dependent or balanced by demographic and social forces. Evolution is not a perfection engine. It does not remove every inconvenience. It allows many imperfect traits to remain if they do not sharply reduce reproduction. Blue eyes persist partly because there is no overwhelming reason they must disappear. This is the answer, but it's not the kind of answer that fits easily into myth. Blue eyes persist because they are possible, survivable, visible, and historically well carried. They are an accident that found pathways. They are a mutation preserved by people who endured ice hunger, forest farming, migration, disease, and social change. They are not a miracle. They are not a mistake. They are one of the many improbable details that become ordinary once enough generations have lived with them. There is a humbling lesson in that. Human beings often look for meaning in traits because traits are visible. We want the body to explain the past cleanly. But the body is not a simple archive. It is a damaged manuscript copied by chance, edited by migration, smudged by time, and rewritten with every birth. Blue eyes are one line in that manuscript. They tell us something real, but not everything. They point toward ancestry, but they do not define it. They reveal history, but only in fragments. What survives in the record suggests a story of continuity through change. A mutation arises or is preserved somewhere in ancient Western Eurasia. It passes through small populations where drift can raise its frequency. It appears in hunter-gatherers whose overall appearance may not match modern expectations. It enters farming populations through mixture. It moves again through steppe expansions and later historical migrations. It gathers cultural meanings, some admiring, some fearful, some false. It spreads globally through diaspora, empire, trade, and family. At every stage, the trait remains physically simple and historically complicated. This is why no single explanation fully accounts for blue eyes. The moment one cause is isolated, another appears behind it. If one says mutation, the question becomes why it spread. If one says northern climate, the question becomes why other northern peoples did not develop the same pattern. If one says beauty, the question becomes why the trait first rose enough to be noticed. If one says drift, the question becomes why it persisted through later mixing. The answer is not one key. It is a ring of keys, each opening only part of the door, and perhaps that is fitting. Blue eyes themselves are made from interaction. They are not a solid blue substance. They are a meeting of low pigment iris structure, light, and perception. Their history is similarly interactive gene, population, landscape, culture, and chance. Remove one element and the story changes. Put them together and the unlikely becomes visible. By now the mystery has travelled far from that first imagined child in ancient Europe. It has passed through ice margins, forests, villages, burial grounds, laboratories, myths, and modern streets. Yet the core remains small enough to fit inside the iris. A tiny regulatory change alters pigment. Light returns differently. Human beings notice. Generations carry the difference forward. And after thousands of years, a person opens their eyes in the present, unaware that their gaze contains a trace of migrations older than any written language. That trace is not a title, not a rank, not a destiny. It is a reminder that the human past survives in delicate ways, sometimes in bones, sometimes in tools, sometimes in words, sometimes in the colour that appears when there is less pigment than expected, and light finds the space to scatter. A blue eye is a small thing to carry so much time. It is only a thin ring of tissue around a pupil, a living aperture that widens in darkness and narrows in light. Yet inside that ring is a history older than kingdoms, older than alphabets, older than the first cities rising from river mud. It is not a history a person chooses. It is inherited silently, without memory, without explanation, without any awareness of the dead who made it possible. A modern person can look into a mirror and see only colour. But behind that colour are vanished forests, drowned plains, winter camps, farming frontiers, steppe roads, burial grounds, and thousands of ordinary births that left no names behind. This is what makes blue eyes a window into deep time. They are not important because they are rare in some places or common in others. They are important because they show how the human body preserves traces of events too old for story. No one remembers the first carrier of the mutation. No one knows where that person slept, what language they heard, what food they ate, what dangers surrounded them, or whether anyone noticed the unusual colour in their gaze. The evidence remains incomplete, and it will probably always remain incomplete. Ancient DNA can recover fragments, archaeology can reconstruct landscapes, genetics can model probabilities, but the first human life at the centre of the change is gone beyond recovery. Still something endured. That is the astonishing part. A mutation that could easily have vanished instead passed into descendants. It moved through small groups where chance mattered intensely. It survived the instability of post-Ice Age Europe. It persisted as forests spread, seas rose, and coastlines disappeared. It entered communities that hunted, gathered, farmed, herded, traded, fought, buried their dead, and moved on. It crossed into new ancestries, new languages, new cultures, and new meanings. It became common enough in some regions to feel ordinary while remaining unusual enough globally to keep its sense of strangeness. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Mutation created the possibility. Drift and bottlenecks gave it early room. Migration carried it through changing populations. Mate choice may have amplified it in certain communities. Cultural meaning later magnified it far beyond biology. But none of these forces alone is the answer. Blue eyes exist because human history is cumulative and untidy. They exist because small accidents can survive when attached to people who survive. They exist because inheritance is not a straight road but a web of crossings. The deepest lesson may be that the human past is not arranged for modern expectations. Ancient people did not come in the neat combinations that later imagination invented. Some early Europeans may have had dark skin and blue eyes. Some early farmers may have had lighter skin without many blue eyes. Some later populations combined traits that had once moved separately. The modern face is not a direct photograph of the ancient face. It is a collage. Every person is assembled from fragments of older worlds, and those fragments do not always come with labels. This matters because visible traits have so often been misused. Eye colour has been turned into myth, hierarchy, romance, suspicion, and false identity. But the scientific story dissolves those fantasies. Blue eyes do not prove purity. They do not mark superiority. They do not belong to one people in any timeless sense. They are a variation shaped by mutation and history, carried through mixture and scattered across the world by movement both gentle and violent. Their beauty, if one sees beauty in them, is not in any imagined rank. It is in their improbability. The same is true of many human traits. Freckles, hair, texture, skin tone, lactose tolerance, blood types, disease, resistance, facial features, and countless invisible genetic variants all carry histories of adaptation, chance, and migration. The body is a record, but not a simple one. It remembers through chemistry rather than language. It keeps what generations pass down, not what they understand. It preserves traces of famine and abundance isolation, and contact survival and loss. Every living person is therefore an archive, though most of its pages are unreadable without science, and many remain unreadable even with it. Blue eyes are especially striking because their history is visible. A person does not need a laboratory to notice them, but the visible part is only the surface. Beneath it is a regulatory change near pigment genes. Beneath that is a chain of parents and children. Beneath that is a continent reshaped by ice and warming. Beneath that is the long migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa and into every kind of landscape the planet offered. The blue gaze is not separate from that wider human story. It is one small flash within it, and perhaps that is why the mystery continues to fascinate. It begins with a contradiction. Blue eyes seem vivid, yet they are made from absence. They seem symbolic, yet they are produced by physics. They seem modern and familiar, yet they reach back into deep prehistory. They seem to invite simple answers, yet every simple answer fails. The more closely one looks, the less the question becomes about colour alone. It becomes about how chance enters history, how small groups shape the future, how the dead remain in the living, how a trait can travel farther than any memory of its origin. So blue eyes should not be treated as impossible. They exist because life is full of unlikely survivals, but they should be treated as remarkable, not for the myths people have attached to them, but for the journey they reveal. A small mutation becomes a visible trait. A visible trait survives the hazards of prehistory. A prehistoric inheritance enters culture, art, fear, beauty, and identity. Then science returns to it and strips away the legends, not to make it less fascinating, but to show that reality was stranger all along. Somewhere in the deep past, a child opened pale eyes in a world that could not explain them. The people around that child did not know about melanin alleles scattering or ancient population structure. They knew only the face before them, the weather outside, the need for food, the closeness of danger, and the fragile hope that the child would live. The child did live, or someone like that child did. Enough descendants lived, enough chances aligned, enough migrations carried the trait onward. And now, thousands of years later, that same optical blue still appears when light enters the iris and finds less darkness than expected. In the end, the mystery of blue eyes does not close like a solved riddle. It fades outward into the larger mystery of human survival. A colour that seems simple, at first becomes a passage into deep time, into landscapes without names, into families no record remembers, into the long chain of accidents that makes any living person possible. The blue itself is only light scattering through tissue where pigment is low. Yet around that light gathers the movement of people through ice, forest, field, sea, empire, and memory. The first carriers are gone. Their shelters are dust, their paths are buried, their coastlines may lie under water. They did not know they were carrying a future symbol. They did not know their descendants would be studied in laboratories, painted in portraits, praised, misunderstood, mythologized, or reduced to stories far too simple for the truth. They lived inside immediate needs, warmth, food, kin danger, weather, sleep. And somewhere inside those ordinary lives a rare inheritance remained. That is often how the past survives, not as monuments, not as kings' names, not as carved stone. Sometimes it survives in a child's face, in a small variation of pigment, in a trait that crosses centuries without explanation. The body remembers what the mind cannot. It carries the lost migrations, the vanished camps, the forgotten meetings between strangers who became ancestors. It carries both chance and endurance. Blue eyes should not be treated as destiny, purity, or proof of anything grand. They are more fragile and more interesting than that. They are a reminder that human beings are mosaics, assembled from movement and mixture, from survival and disappearance, from choices made by people who never imagined us. Every gaze carries some version of that story, whether brown, black, hazel, green, grey or blue. And so the final image is not a throne or a battlefield or a map coloured by ancestry. It is quieter. It is someone standing under a pale sky, perhaps in the north, perhaps far from it, light entering the eye and returning changed. In that brief shimmer is a trace of ice ages, migrations, hunger, beauty, misunderstanding and time, a tiny colour born from absence still looking back.